Welcome to Lo-Fi Code, where we learn to code in bite-sized pieces. Today we are talking about boxes and containers in HTML. Before we get into that, though, we first have to talk about inline and block elements. So what is that? An inline element is almost what it sounds like. It's an HTML element that lines up all on the same line. When you create two of them back to back, they show up in the same line, not one after the other vertically. So what does that look like? Well, let's make a span, which is one of our inline elements, and we're going to call it hello. And then we'll make, let's copy this, make another one. We'll call it world. And how do you expect this to show up in the document? Well, since they're inline, if we refresh, we see that they show up one after the other, right? So that's inline. An inline element shows up one after the other all along the same line. And if we copy this and paste it a few times, we can see what happens as it stretches across the screen. It wraps, right? So inline elements will continue to take up horizontal space until there's not enough space, and then they'll wrap to the next line, which is really useful. So compared to a span, which is an inline element, what if we delete all these except for hello and world, and we switch these to p tags? How do we expect that to behave? A p tag is a block level element. So if we save that and refresh, they show up one after the other, right? And if we come in here in the inspector and we highlight our hello, right? If we look at the blue box there, it takes up the full width. So does world, right? These are block level elements. What happens if we combine them, right? What happens if we put a span in front and then a p tag? What does that do? Well, more or less the same thing, right? Our span still only takes up, if we look at the box here, just a little bit of the horizontal space, but since the p tag is a block level element, it's still taking up the full width. So once again, if we switch them back to spans, save and refresh, we have our inline elements side by side. Some other inline elements other than a span, the formatting tags that we talked about in our last video are also all inline, including A tags, which we haven't really talked about links yet, but we will. Abbreviations, EMs, strongs, BI, all that stuff, they're all inline. And it's inline elements. Now we'll talk about block level elements. So the biggest block level element, or the most common one, I should say, is a div. They're used all over the place in web development. A div means a division, and a div is basically, you can think of it, just a big box, a big container. And since we're not talking about styling yet, the default block level stuff, and if we hover over it, it'll tell us here. The div element has no special meaning at all. It represents its children. It can be used with the class, lang, and title attributes to mark up semantics common to a group of consecutive elements. So a div is a box, right? And if we save that and we put our two spans in the box, what's going to change? Nothing really, except if we expand our stuff here, we can see that our div holds our two spans. So that's a div. Why don't we color it a little bit so we can visualize what it looks like, right? And we're not really going to get too into styling here. We're just going to make it red. We'll save that and refresh. And you can see there's our div. And it's a block level element. And if we copy and paste it and we change this one, let's make this one blue, right? Just so we can see the difference. Blue. Fresh. Ooh, the contrast on that is pretty bad. Let's make this color, which is the text color, white, right? So these divs, by default, are kind of stacking up right next to each other, and they don't have any margins around them except on the, let's see where these margins are coming from. The margins are on the, it's the HTML element, takes up the whole space. Oh, it's the body. So by default in Firefox, the body has some margin on it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any margin, and a div is just a big box. We see divs commonly, and when we hovered over it, it did talk about how divs have no special meaning at all. It requires the developer to go in and add classes and stuff like that to make it semantic and have more meaning. In HTML5, we're all about semantics and we're all about meaning. We're marking up something, a document, so that when we when the browser renders it, it can add in intelligent information and render it in all kinds of different ways that we don't even intend when we're coding for it to render. Majorly thinking about a screen reader. Or perhaps someone posts a link to your website on Twitter, and Google has an idea of what your website looks like just by looking at what tags you used, right? It's interpreting your document, not by how it looks, like how your standard user might look at it, but, in a more programmatic way. So what am I getting at? A div has no meaning, so instead we're going to talk about sections, articles, headers, nav, main, and footer, which are all block level elements, and they all have way more semantic meaning than a div. So let's add all of these in here in the order that you would normally see them. So we would have a header, and in there we would have a nav, and we'll talk about what these mean. Beneath our header, we might have a main element, right? And then beneath that main, we might have a footer, right? And then why don't we add some text in here? I'm the footer. And it's totally valid to just put some text right in here. I'm the main. I'm the nav. I'm the header, right? Let's save that and refresh and see what that looks like, right? And when we hover over it, we can see the header includes the text, I'm the header, and it also includes a nav. The main is right in the middle, and at the bottom we have a footer. So let's look at these from the MDN documentation and see what it says. The header element represents introductory content for its nearest ancestor, sectioning content or sectioning root element. A header typically contains a group of introductory or navigational aids. When the nearest ancestor, sectioning content or sectioning root element is the body element, then it applies to the whole page. So what that's saying is normally you would have the header as a child of the body. Right? There's no div wrapping the header, right? We wouldn't do this and put the header in there, right? That's it's doing the same thing twice, right? A header is already a block level element. We don't need to put it inside of a div. And a lot of this stuff will make a whole lot more sense once we get into styling. But yeah, the header contains the stuff at the top of your page, right? And so what's at the top of the page? Some text here that says, I'm the header, and a nav. Now what's a nav? The nav element represents a section of a page that links to other pages or to parts within the page, a section with navigation links. So why don't we do that? Why don't we put some navigation links in here? Let's put an unordered list. We previously talked about ordered lists. An unordered list is just a bulleted list, right? And the children of an unordered list are always LIs. You always have UL and then LI in there. If you have some intermediary tag, like a div wrapping this li, that's invalid HTML. We won't go into that. Let's put a couple li's here inside our ul. So ul means unordered list, li means list item, right? And so within here, we're going to put some a tags, and I should have just copied and pasted this instead. And an a tag is a link. We'll get into links later. For now, I'm just going to say about, and we'll say contact. And I don't know if this will render with no, it won't. So we want to throw href on there. See if that works just without a HTTP. Sure enough. Okay, so here's our navigation, right? Here is our nav element for how to get about our website. And normally these links would link to other pages within your website. So we'll talk about links later. But here's a nav. And this is a standard what you might see inside of a nav. When we get into styling, you might see, oh, maybe I don't want the bullet points, right? Maybe I want them to go horizontally in a line, change the orientation of the layout of the flow or whatever. But yeah, nav, unordered list, li with a's. This is all very normal, common. So outside of the header, and we can make that, why don't we make this header, give it a color. Style, background color, let's give it fa. Now it's kind of a gray. It might be hard to see in the video. Great. And now we can do our main. Why don't we put a different gray on there? Why don't we give it a F0, F0, F0. Right, here's our main. So our main is the main element. It represents the main content of the body of a document or application. So the main is if you were looking at the New York Times website, right, it would be all the stuff that, all the articles and everything. So why don't we actually pull up NewYorkTimes.com and we can see, so up here, this is our header, right up on top. And then within our header is a nav, right? We talked about that before. Their nav has this cool pop out thing, but this is a nav. And then here is the main, right? Here's the main content. Over here, maybe potential within the main, there could be sections, right? This might be a section here in this box. Maybe this is a section. Maybe this is a section. And if we switch over here, we could say, why don't we put a section? Put a P in our section, right? I'm the section. Yeah. And then we might also have an aside. An aside is yet another box. And all of these different names for boxes, they all work the same, right? They're all basically behaving just like divs. But we use these semantic names instead of div because they actually have meaning, right? Main means it's the main element of the page. If it was a div, that's not really communicating anything. The developer would have to come in here and add a class or something special, which we'll get into later when we get into styling, to mark up what the div means. So instead, let's switch it back to main. And maybe now let's look and see what comes after the main. Oh, the footer probably, right? So let's scroll down and see what their footer looks like. Right, here's their footer. It's got a bunch of other navigation in it, right? So there might be another nav inside the footer. Or perhaps there's just a bunch of lists in here. A bunch of unordered lists or columns. Maybe this is a table, right? Who knows how they have it oriented. And we can actually inspect it and take a look at it. Let's check it out. So let's see here. See, they have a nav here. After their main, they have a nav, and their nav is near the bottom of the page. This down here is their footer. So if we scroll down even further, we can see, yep, here's the footer. And the footer also contains a nav, right? So there can be multiple navs throughout the page that navigate to different pages. And we have an H2, an unordered list, an LI, right? And each of these LIs is, right, here's an unordered list. All these different links, right? This looks very similar to what we just made. So here is the main and footer. Let's quickly hover over section and see what it has to say about that. The section element represents a generic section of a document or application. A section in this context is a thematic grouping of content. Each section should be identified, typically by including a heading, H1 through H6 element, as a child of the section element. So why don't we do that? Why don't we put a H1 in here, or an H3. Let's do an H3. This is my section. Let's save that and refresh the page and see what we get. Yep, so here's my section. Looks like we're getting our aside is also saying I'm the section, so why don't we fix that? I'm the aside. So let's talk about what an aside is. Aside element represents a section of a page that consists of content that is tangentially related to the content around the aside element, and which could be considered separate from that content. Such sections are often represented as sidebars in printed typography. So let's see if we can find an aside element on the New York Times website, right? This might be an aside, right? Perhaps this guy right here is an aside, right? It's a column going down the side of the page, right? And out of the box, you don't get that styling, right? The aside is showing up as a full width, basically just like how a div renders out of the box. So we would have to add styling to go and move it over to the side if that's what we wanted to do. But like I said, these are semantic words to add more meaning. Another one I just thought of, which is worth covering, is not an aside, it is an article. So an article represents a complete or self-contained composition in a document, page, application, or site, and that is in principle independently distributable or reusable in syndication. This could be forum post, magazine, newspaper article, blog entry, or user-submitted comment, an interactive widget or gadget, or any other independent item of content, right? So the main thing is that an article stands alone, and it should be able to, probably is something that could be shared. Oftentimes, if you created a link to a page and you shared it on Twitter, and that page had an article in it, it's possible that when Twitter reads your website to build its fancy preview of your website, it might look for the article and pull out the first P tag in the article and make that the leading text on your website. If you've ever wondered how that kind of thing works, semantic HTML is what powers that all of those cool integrations on the web. And I think we talked about footer already, but the footer represents its nearest. The footer represents a footer for its nearest ancestor, sectioning content or sectioning root element. A footer typically contains information about its section, such as who wrote it, links to related documents, copyright data, and the like. Great. So that covers the containers that I wanted to talk about. And an important thing here is, one thing I want to touch on is that you can put as many things inside of a container as you want. And in HTML, or in an HTML document, depending on how you style it, by default, the page will just keep on growing vertically, right? So if I come in here and I copy all this stuff, and I just paste a bunch, and I save, hopefully that's long enough, right? The page just grows. It's a big document. It's a way of marking up text content and styling it, right? At its core, that's what HTML is. Of course, now with the new web, we can add all kinds of other stuff like images and videos and all kinds of interactive stuff. But at its core, that's what it is. And it's boxes and boxes of content. And that's enough of me rambling today. I hope you learned something about containers and boxes in HTML. And thank you so much for watching, and happy hacking.